What's up, everybody, and welcome to part 2 of this horror franchise tier list series, and now we are at the sequels. So about a week or so ago, I did a whole horror franchise tier list where I had 33 horror original movies, and that was going to be the first part of a multi-episode series, and now we are at the very first sequel, so number 2 in each of these franchises. Just like last time, the tier categories are as follows from best to worst. We have horror classics, bloody good time, kills 2 hours, painful, and slow death. Let me know down in the comments where you guys would stick these 33 sequels, and with that being said, let's kick it off with Paranormal Activity 2, which is a kills 2 hours for me. Just like I said in the last video, I'm not really a big fan of found footage. I don't really think any of the Paranormal Activity films are all that great. There is one that I'll probably stick in bloody good time, but overall, they're movies that have a neat concept. They certainly have their following. I'm just not really one of them. All of these movies that I have actually seen, some of which I'm going to have to watch for the first time near the end of this series, they all seem to get really good and intense for like the last 10 to 15 minutes, and then the movie's over. But before that, there is a whole lot of meandering. Next up, we have Psycho 2, and this might be an unpopular opinion, but this is going right up to horror classics for me. Yes, I do have it above the original Psycho. This is my favorite in the franchise. I respect the hell out of the original Psycho, as I said in the last video, but I genuinely love Psycho 2. It is a very, very underappreciated sequel. It is a very well-written sequel, written by Tom Holland, the guy that brought us Fright Night, Child's Play, supposed to be bringing us another Fright Night at some point. And it's just a really damn good story. You think about somebody trying to make a sequel to a Alfred Hitchcock classic 20-something years after the original film, and you're like, are you high off your ass? And the story that they decide to go with here, where Norman isn't necessarily the bad guy, is just genius to me. I adore this movie. I think it's one of the most underappreciated sequels on this list, but really of all time. Now we have the Purge Anarchy, and this one is definitely a bloody good time. I also think that that is the best of that franchise thus far. This pretty much gave everybody that had issues with The Purge the movie that they wanted. They were like, hey, show us a movie outside of these walls. Show us The Purge itself. And that's pretty much what this is. It's kind of a Punisher movie too. You got Frank Grillo in here on kind of the Frank Castle role. It's a good flick. It's got some good kills in it. There's some action mixed in with there. It's got a nice pace to it. This is, if any of the Purge films, one that I will pull off of my shelves and rewatch quite frequently. Now we are at A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddys Revenge, and this one is kills 2 hours for me. This is a weird one. This is a movie that it seemed like everybody hated for the longest time, and then here recently, more so because of the legacy and because of Mark Patton's legacy and the documentary that came out, and it's starting to get a lot more notoriety. People are kind of coming around to this one and starting to appreciate it a lot more. It's a movie that's firmly planted in the middle for me, because while I do think this has one of the darkest and most effective versions of Freddy, and I do think that there's some pretty good sequences in here as far as nightmares and the way that they light it and the way that Freddy's always in the shadows, and Mark Patton is a good actor, I do think it's a very weird movie. And I don't just mean that and because of all of the homosexual tones that were kind of brought to the forefront, the legacy that the movie is known for. I'm not even really commenting on that. There's just a lot of really weird stylistic choices and story choices for this to be a direct follow-up to the original Nightmare on Elm Street. I mean, you got like the parakeet exploding, and you got the gym teacher that makes all the kids take showers as punishments, and he's at the S&M bar, and there's so many weird things about this movie that it's very memorable. It's very easy to talk about this movie, but it's not really one of the Nightmare on Elm Street films that I find myself going back to watch very often. Coming up next, we got Halloween 2, and I have actually really grown warm to this movie over the years. I'm sticking it in bloody good time. I think it's actually one of the best of the Halloween sequels. It doesn't quite compare to the first film because they kind of lose a lot of that John Carpenter element from that first one, so I don't think that it's nearly as effective. I don't think that Michael's nearly as effective, and it certainly takes a lot more inspiration from like the Friday the 13th slashers than it does the previous Halloween film. But it's a good movie. It's a good slasher. It's got a lot of great kills. The Michael Myers here is one of the better ones. It's stylistically, and the visual of it looks very much like the original film, so you can watch these as kind of one whole movie. A lot of people do that on Halloween night. And it's a good turn your brain off type slasher. It doesn't offer quite as much as the first film, but if you're there just to see Michael Myers kill people, this is one of the more entertaining and one of the more effective of the Halloween sequels. Now we have Jaws 2, and this one is painful for me. It's not like a garbage movie. If you're gonna watch a Jaws sequel, you better watch that one, because the rest of them ain't getting any better, I can promise you that. But it's just a rehash. It's just an absolute rehash of the first film with none of the magic, with none of the great characterizations that are in that, with obviously not Steven Spielberg. So it's just a very kind of cheap cash grab knockoff of the first movie with a lot more shark in it. And I don't think that it does the movie any favors to show the shark anymore. So I used to like this a lot when I was a kid because I liked seeing the shark more. When I watched it as an adult for the 31 on 31 creature features a couple years ago, this one just put me to sleep. Oh my God, The Exorcist 2, The Heretic. This is going right into slow death. Look, when I do these review series, there is always at least one movie that everybody's always like, oh man, that one is the dumpster fire. I can't wait to see how much you hate that one. And more times than not, it gets so overhyped for being bad that when I finally see the bad one, I'm like, it was fine. Like, it's not good, but it wasn't near as bad as you guys made it out to be. Not the case with this one. This movie was fucking horrible. I had never seen it before last year, for last year's 31 on 31 for Unholy Terrors. And this easily was the worst of all 31 movies that we watched. I mean, this was just a baffling story choice to follow up The Exorcist. There was just really weird stylistic choices, very similar to Nightmare on Elm Street 2, where it's just like, where the fuck did you get that from? There's locusts, and there's mind reading and telekinesis, and you have Regan, whatever the fuck, I always mess her name up, is communicating with people through her mind, and she expels the demon by doing this little fucking dance at the end. Like, it is painful to watch. It is a movie where you look at it and you go, clearly there's a competent filmmaker behind here, but how the fuck did this script get greenlit? Now we have Scream 2, and this one is going up to bloody good time. I think that all of the Scream movies are pretty consistent. Really, aside from Scream 3, which is still pretty solid for a slasher sequel, they're all pretty consistent with quality for me. I've said in the last one, I'm a very casual Scream fan. I'm not somebody that lives and dies by this franchise, but I do enjoy pretty much all of them. Scream 2 is a good sequel. It has that creativity, that meta-ness that the first one had, where they're kind of playing off of slasher sequels and the tropes that come along with that. A little bit more of a heightened tension to it with making the kill scenes a little bit bigger. Not extravagantly bigger, but a little bit bigger. And I really do love the reveals of the killers. A lot of people don't seem to like the reveals in this movie. Apparently the script was leaked and they had to change shit, but the two killers that we get revealed in this movie, they're among my favorites of the ghost faces. So I have a lot of fun with Scream 2. It's a good one. Phantasm II. This is an absolute horror classic. I actually watched this one for years before I even saw the first film when I was a kid. I've always loved Phantasm II and the first one, and more often than not, I will say that I prefer Phantasm II. It's got a lot of the things that I love about the first one. It's got some of that trippy, cerebral storytelling. It's got the great characters and everything in there, and it's genuinely creepy and creative. But this one's more exciting, it's more fun to watch, it's more action-packed, the budget is much bigger, the effects are much better, so sometimes I like kind of the more 70s appeal to the first film, and I'll like that one a little bit better, but most times when you ask me, this is my favorite of the franchise. So if you're somebody that watched the first Phantasm and didn't quite get it, wasn't really for you, I would encourage you to watch the second one. The second one is by far the one that I think would have the most mass appeal. Now we have the Conjuring II, and that's absolutely a bloody good time. This one, I wouldn't say it's as good as the first one, but it's pretty close. You know, it's just a little bit too long. They go on for a little bit too much, and it doesn't quite have quite the same punch that the first film had, but there's a really good story here that's a version of a true story, certainly a lot more heightened for Hollywood's sake, but I like the character of Valak as like the nun character. Got wasted in the Solo movie, but very effective in this movie. I like the way that Ed and Lorraine Warren get utilized in this one. Like, one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie is where Ed is playing that Elvis song, and it's just like this really cool, quiet, intimate moment in the middle of this crazy horror film. A lot of really great effects, a lot of really good scares here, which you can come to expect from James Wan. It's a solid sequel to the original Conjuring. Ugh, Lost Boys the Tribe. Go fuck yourself. This goes right into slow death. Look, don't even acknowledge the fact that there's sequels to The Lost Boys. Like, I'm sorry. There's just nothing of merit in this film, and there's barely anything of merit in the third film. The Lost Boys was a one and done. That is the reality that I choose to live in. I remember when this movie was coming out, even as a really young buck, I was like in my early 20s maybe. I was like, why? Why? What are you doing? Oh my God. And when I finally watched this, it's basically taking certain elements from the first film and doing it in a really extremely low budget shitty way with actors that aren't very good. I think Kiefer Sutherland's cousin or something like that is playing the main vampire here, and he's terrible. You have returning characters like Corey Feldman here as Edgar Frog, and he's not very good either. This is a sequel that was churned out way, 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 way too late, and there was no effort whatsoever put into it. So this is a movie that I watched once. Eventually I'll have to watch it again to probably review it, but I have never had the desire to ever see it again. It was trash. Oh, we got another one. We got Blair Witch 2. This one is also going into slow death. This is a movie that I was actually looking forward to watching last year because I'm not really a big fan of the first Blair Witch, nor am I a big fan of the third Blair Witch. So this one was that weird one where I knew it wasn't found footage, and I was like, am I going to have one of those weird opinions where I actually like the second one more than the one that everybody else likes? And so I was very curious about why everybody despises this movie. And when I watched it, I quickly found out. There was an interesting idea at the core of this, but it was just so mangled by studio interference and reshoots and script rewrites that what we are left with is a completely incomprehensible dreck of a movie that just gave me a headache. It's just a bunch of nonsense. You have all these characters that are fans of the movie within the movie of Blair Witch, and they go off into the woods and a bunch of crazy shit starts happening, but it's told in flashbacks while they're already like in prison, so it takes away all of the mystery of who's gonna live and who's gonna die, and it is, by the end of it, it's just a giant clusterfuck. Like, the original script could have possibly been something cool, but by the end of it, you just have pieces of all these different scripts, these different ideas that don't add up to a movie whatsoever. So, big missed opportunity. They're probably, if there's ever going to be like a director's cut release of this, I would be fascinated to watch it, but the movie that we have as is was painful as fuck to watch. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2 is absolutely a bloody good time for me. And this is a weird sequel because there's things about it that I love and there's things about it that also aggravate me every single time that I watch it, namely like the last 15 minutes. And it's for the same reasons that I get aggravated with the original Texas Chainsaw, where it's just screaming and mania, and it just gives me a headache with Stretch just screaming the entire third act of the film. But this one is entertaining. It's not quite as iconic, or it doesn't have the legacy of the first film, not by a long shot, but it's such a weird tonal shift that I've always enjoyed it. It's much more of a horror comedy, and it's kind of screwball to a certain degree, and there's something about that weird mix that's just appealing to me. I really like the character of Chop Top, played by Bill Moseley. I like the way that this continues the story of the first film to a certain extent, with Dennis Hopper's character trying to get vengeance for his nephew and niece, basically, from the first film. It's just a wild, weird ride. It's not a movie that I watch all the time, but when I'm in the mood for a Texas Chainsaw movie, sometimes I'm in a really weird mood and throw this one on, and I always have a pretty good time with it. Now we're at Poltergeist 2. This one is a kills 2 hours. I was really interested in checking this one out after I had rewatched the first Poltergeist and realized how awesome that movie was and kicked myself in the ass for not watching it so much more. And when I went immediately into Poltergeist 2, which has pretty much the entire returning cast here, I was really disappointed to find out that it was kind of just a rehash of the first movie, but not nearly as good. I like the villain of Kane as like a new character. I thought that he was effectively creepy without being real over the top. He was like this subtle old man creepy, and the whole lore that they brought about this priest that killed all these people inside of this cavern, and that was all really cool. And there's some good effects in here as well, but the story direction was just odd to me. It was kind of, again, just a rehash of the first film, but lost all of the magic. You could tell that Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg were not working on this one because it just didn't have that it factor that makes the first one such a timeless classic. This one's just more Poltergeist stuff, but not nearly as inspired. Now we have Critters 2, and this also is a kills 2 hours. This one, much like the first film, I thought was fine. And when I watched them again over time, I might grow to like them a little bit more. This one was certainly the most fun of the Critters movies. It kind of takes its concept in a little bit more of a goofy movie tone. You've got like the space rangers that come back down, and one of them takes the form of a Playboy model, and there's some jokes about it possibly taking the form of Freddy Krueger that was nice. This one has a little bit more fun with the gore. You've got the giant ball of Krites that roll over people and they just have a skeleton left, and they're eating all the cheeseburgers, and so it's a little bit more of a goofy B-movie version of the first film. And so when I rewatch these, I don't know whether I would say Critters 1 or Critters 2 is better, but it was fine. It was a movie that I had a decent time with. I'm not in any rush to go back and rewatch it, but certainly it was watchable and I could kill 2 hours and have a decent time with it, where the Critters movies after 2, not so much. Now we have Blade 2. Again, just like the last video, if you don't consider it horror, I really don't care. This is my list, and it's absolutely a horror classic for me. I love Blade 2. I love the first Blade, but Blade 2 to me was just like one of the most badass movies ever. It's still one of my favorite vampire movies. I love the Reapers, that design where they have like the mouth that opens sideways, very influenced by Guillermo del Toro and the show that he eventually led that was the same concept. I think that the action is better in this one. I think that the story's a little bit more interesting. You got Norman Reedus in here as a really great side character. Even though they kind of have a lazy explanation for why Whistler is back, I don't give a fuck because that character's awesome, and he's even more awesome in this one. This is one of my favorite sequels, period. I think that it's going to be a very tall order, no matter how much quality the MCU is known for, to make a Blade film that's anywhere near as badass as this one. Now we're at Fright Night Part 2, the least talked about of any of these sequels, and it is absolutely a bloody good time. This is a movie that I really don't know why it took me so long to watch it. I think because nobody talks about it, I just assumed it was shitty, and I didn't really want to experience it, because that tends to be the case, right? If a movie's shitty, it's either notorious for being shitty or people just don't talk about it. And I love the first Fright Night so much that I was like, do I really want to watch a sequel that's going to possibly lessen that experience for me? And so I finally got convinced to watch this by my buddy Joey Sasso about a month ago. And this is a really good sequel to the first movie, to the point where it baffles me why more people don't talk about it. It's directed by Tommy Lee Wallace. That's the guy that brought us Halloween 3. That's either a really good thing for those of us that love that movie and understand how genius that it is, or a really bad thing for all you Myers cultists that just don't want a Halloween movie that doesn't have Michael Myers in it, and you can't look past that. Nonetheless, I'm kidding. Nonetheless, Fright Night Part 2 is a movie that takes the concept of the first movie, doesn't necessarily do a rehash, but continues a very natural storyline to where Charlie is going through therapy, convincing himself that everything in the first film might not have existed, and you have a vampire coming for revenge for Jerry Dandridge's death. And so she targets Charlie and she targets Peter Vincent, and they're stuck in this like game that it seems like they're not going to be able to win almost throughout the entire movie. The effects are really good. The comedy is pretty good. It's not anywhere near as good as the first Fright Night, but let's be honest, very few films are. But for a sequel, especially one that nobody talks about, I had a really good time with it. Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, this one kills 2 hours. There tends to be a lot of people that either like the first Hellraiser or they like the second Hellraiser as the best of the franchise. To me, the second one's a little too weird. It's a little too out there for me. It's a little bit more gothic, a little bit more fantastical. The characters in the movie actually explore like this hell dimension that the Cenobites are from at one point, and it's very weird. It's much more fantasy than it is horror. You have this doctor that becomes like this succubus that's on his head, and he takes out all the Cenobites like with ease, which is still a weird thing for me to experience. Like, the Cenobites are the reason we're here, not that fucking guy. It's an okay sequel. Story-wise, it's a good follow-up to the first one because you have Julia that comes back and kind of becomes the new Frank, and all of that I like. It's everything in the back half that's just a little too out there for me. So, not a movie that I'm ever in a really big hurry to rewatch. Insidious Chapter 2. This one is painful for me. Now, I told you in the last video, I've actually dropped how much I like the original Insidious a decent amount over time, which is surprising for me. I don't do that very often. But the second film, I've never really been a big fan of. I don't like the story direction of it. I think that it kills the ending of the first film, which should have been just a one-off, and it also lessens that whole bride character from the first movie that I think is terrifying, and it gives all this extra explanation for who it is and kind of ruins that character to a degree. And I just don't really enjoy this one. It has a lot of the same tricks up its sleeve as the first film with the loud piano booms and all that kind of gave me a headache the last time that I watched the first one, but it's done to a much less effective degree here. And so it just, story-wise, I don't really enjoy this sequel that much. I don't think that it was needed, and I much prefer the first or the third film over this one. Now we've got Jeepers Creepers 2, and this one kills 2 hours. It borders on bloody good time at points of it. I think it's got an awesome opening. I like the whole concept of it being this isolation movie inside of this school bus. It's the writing and the characters that really let this movie down. Filled with a bunch of students that are all caricatures, that are all just ridiculous, unlikable people. And when you know more of the history of Victor Salva, there's a lot of undertones, arguably overtones in this movie that are a bit suspect. But as a movie that's focused on the creeper, that's on the horror side of things, that's on the lore and everything, I enjoy all of that. This was a movie that I saw in a drive-in, and it's perfect for one of those drive-in experiences. So, decent sequel, nowhere near as good as the first film. Now we're at Friday the 13th Part 2. This one is also going in kills 2 hours. There's very few Friday the 13th films that I will put above that, just to let you know. It's just not my franchise, so respect that or don't. Friday the 13th Part 2. I was going to say Friday the 3rd. Friday the 13th Part 2, I think, is a sequel that improves upon the original in just about every way. Is still not necessarily one of my favorites or a movie that I revisit all that often. Friday the 13th Part 2, I think, is a sequel that pretty much improves upon just about everything in the first film. I think the kills are better. I think that it's made slightly better, not a huge improvement. I think that the acting and the characters are certainly just a little bit better. Jenny, quite often, is people's favorite final girl in this entire franchise. There's reason for that. She's a very good character. And I like some of the lore that they bring in with this movie, with Jason being the killer, with them being able to kind of put him in a trance with Mother's sweatshirt and standing in front of the shrine and all of that. It's cool little details to add to the character and add to the lore. Some of the better kills, I love the kill with the machete to the face and the wheelchair guy goes backwards down these stairs. That's one of everybody's favorite kills for the most part, so nothing new there. It's a fine Friday the 13th movie. If I'm watching through the franchise, I mostly enjoy this one. Evil Dead 2. This is probably going to be, if anything, my controversial take, because it's going and kills 2 hours for me. I've never been a big fan of this movie. It just doesn't work for me. I know that most people that are horror fans, and certainly most people that are Evil Dead fans, think that that's the best, that that's the cream of the crop, but for whatever reason, it's just never been that movie for me. I much prefer the first Evil Dead, or I much prefer Army of Darkness, significantly prefer the remake. The remake, I think, is the shit, but for some weird reason, I prefer my Evil Dead movies to be mostly horror or mostly slapstick. And when you try to do them both, like Evil Dead 2 tries to do, it just doesn't quite work for me. And I'm just being honest, that's just how I feel about it. I wish that I loved it, because I hate having opinions like this that I have to get skewered for, but I've just never watched Evil Dead 2 and been like, man, I love this. I see the classic that everybody else sees. I'm always a little bit bored by it after the first half. Now we are at Aliens, absolutely one of the greatest movies ever made, right up to horror classics. This is my preferred Alien movie. People tend to be an Alien fan or an Aliens fan. I'm firmly planted in this group. This is the one that I watched the most growing up, and it's the one that I watched the most as an adult, because I think that this one holds on to most of the horror, most of the elements of the first film, while just upping all the action, upping the excitement, and telling a better story at the end of the day. This is a tale on motherhood, where you have Ripley is sent back into time, and she's in cryostasis, she's asleep. She misses the entire lifespan of her daughter. She's this lost relic of the past that has been found, and she kind of replaces that with the character of Newt. And then you also have the whole motherhood theme with the queen alien and the xenomorphs and everything. And so it's just a really cleverly written story that's got a very solid theme at the heart of it. But even beyond all that, it's some of the best action and horror that you're going to see from any movie ever. It's just an absolute classic. There's very little negative, if anything I can say negative, about this movie. It's fucking awesome. Now, quite a different conversation when we're talking about Candyman 2 Farewell to the Flesh. That is a painful movie. Candyman, man, he really got the short end of the stick. Has such a great, underappreciated first film, and those two sequels before we got this most recent reboot, whoa, talk about burying a franchise. So Candyman 2 Farewell to the Flesh essentially tries to rehash the same exact types of story as the first film, to where you have this woman that's slowly starting to learn about the legend of Candyman, and she starts toying with it a little bit, and then Candyman shows up, starts cutting people up with his hook, and then it's all about you, whatever the hell this character's name was. The first film, it's all about you, Helen. The second film, it's all about you, new chick. And there's flashbacks that show how he became Candyman, which we never needed to see. We already heard that in the lore and the legends, and we don't ever need to see that because the story was enough. But they decide to show you anyway, just in case you can't put two and two together. And they somehow tie this girl back like she was the descendant of his wife or his lover that got him hooked and killed. I don't know. It's a terrible movie. It's a very, very, very generic as fuck 90s movie that just really, really shits on the momentum that this franchise could have had after that amazing first film. Child's Play 2. Possibly my favorite movie on this entire list, and it's going right up to horror classics. This is a perfect Child's Play movie. It's one of my favorite sequels of all time. It has always been pretty much my favorite, or an argument of my favorite for this franchise, alongside Bride of Chucky. It just has everything, man. Like, Chucky is off the rails in this. Some of the best one-liners, some of the best kills. Alex Vincent is much better in this movie than he was in the first film, and he was still pretty good in the first film, so he's really good in this one. You've got the character of Kyle here that was introduced, which has always been a fan favorite character. And the whole third act in the toy factory is just fucking beautiful. So not anything else that I could say about this movie that I haven't already said 12.5 times. Child's Play 2, absolutely a horror classic. Now we're at Resident Evil Apocalypse, the second film in the Paul W.S. Anderson franchise, and it's a bloody good time as far as I'm concerned. This one, alongside the most recent one, which had its share of problems, to me are easily the best Resident Evil movies that we have gotten. This one is the only movie in the Paul W.S. Anderson franchise that I think really takes a lot of inspiration and pays a lot of respect to the actual fucking video games. What a concept, right? This one is a pretty direct adaptation of the third game, of Nemesis. So you've got a little bit of changes here and there. Of course, Alice being the center of all of it is a big change because that character was never in the games, but there's a lot of things pulled from that third game storyline that makes its way into this movie and works pretty well in live action. I like the live action Nemesis as well. I think that there's some good written humor here performed by Mike Epps. I think that his character is very interesting. And all the surrounding Resident Evil characters that are in this, I think, serve pretty well as side characters. Even though we'd rather see them as the stars of the show, they serve pretty well here. So it's not what a Resident Evil adaptation should be. None of these movies are. That's always going to be its Achilles heel. But if you're on board for this action-centric adaptation of Resident Evil, to me, this is the best of the bunch. Now you got Damien Omen 2, and this one kills 2 hours. It's a solid movie. You know, it's a decent sequel. It's basically carrying on with Damien when he is a teenager. He's in this military school. Obviously, he's been orphaned. And he starts to discover by the end of this movie that he's actually the descendant of Satan, and starts to kind of understand what his purpose is supposed to be, what his legacy is supposed to be. And so that's interesting, but not nearly as interesting as it could be because they don't focus enough on it. Even the point when he finds out definitively who he is. He runs out to the lake and screams, "Why me?" And then that's it. That's all we get. There's no like inner turmoil or decisions that he has to make or some kind of a struggle to where he kind of doesn't want to do that but feels like he's pulled to that. None of that. You get one scene and then he's just full on fucking evil again. There's a lot of Final Destination style kills in this movie that are very entertaining. So if you're here for the gore, there's one on an elevator especially that's pretty fucking awesome. That really does deliver in this movie. I think that there's actually a way to do a modern Omen movie and kind of harness a little bit more of that side of the film, and that would be a pretty fun new take on this material for modern genre fans. But nonetheless, decent sequel, just let me down in the story department. Ironic that we got Final Destination 2 right after Omen, because Omen 2 might as well be one, but this is a horror classic for me. I love this movie. This is my favorite of the Final Destination movies. I remember seeing it in theaters. One of the best theater experiences I've ever had because the audience was just going nuts for every single kill that happened in this. I think that this has the best kills in the entire franchise. I think that the gore effects are the best in this movie. They start to get really cheap looking and really CGI after this. And the story, it's not like a really big reinvention of the wheel as far as the typical Final Destination storyline, but the way that they loop it back into the first film I thought was creative at the time, to where they are all somebody that was in, that dodged death because of the characters in the first movie dodging death. It was a cool little twist at the time, and before the sequels kind of ran that into the ground. But I really do enjoy this. I think if you're in the Final Destination realm as far as just wanting a gory thrill ride, this one is the best one. Oh, now we are at Wrong Turn 2, and I'm going to stick this in painful just because I know how much worse these movies can get. A lot of people seem to defend this movie. When I initially reviewed this, there was a lot of people upset at me that I did not like it at all. What are you talking about? This here, we got Henry Rollins and the gore. And it was still a shit movie. The first one's not really all that great to begin with, and when you take a gigantic step down from that, there's not really a whole lot of worth there. There's not really a whole lot of merit that I can say with this movie. Henry Rollins is cool. He's not somebody that I'm necessarily jumping for joy that's in a movie. He's not like a big badass actor or anything, but he's cool in this as kind of the tough guy. I think that the initial concept of getting these military people into the woods creates an interesting dynamic because they actually have training and weapons, but this is very, very low-hanging fruit as far as slashers go. There is hillbilly incest, there's like hillbilly incest sex scenes, there's cannibalism, and all the gore and the kills aren't really all that great. The effects budget was not very high. I'm just not a fan of this franchise, and Wrong Turn 2 does nothing to change that. Saw 2. Now this one I will stick under bloody good time. This is my favorite of the Saw franchise. I do, in fact, think it's better than the first film in just about every way. I think that the initial storyline here with having Jigsaw and having Donnie Wahlberg kind of going back and forth with this interrogation while this whole situation is going on in the computers with Donnie Wahlberg's son is a really interesting dynamic. I think that the expansion of the trap into this whole like warehouse was really cool, and the cast of characters that are here are all pretty entertaining as well for various reasons. And I think the twist in this movie was even better than the first film, and even better on rewatch. I think that the first film doesn't necessarily hold up over time as much. I know I'm on an island with that one, but that's my opinion. Saw 2 to me, I think, is a legitimately good horror film. It's the one movie of this franchise that I would honestly say is great. Now we're at Predator 2. This one kills 2 hours. It's a decent sequel. Never been a huge fan of it. I like the whole aesthetic of having the Predator in like the urban jungle, as they call it, in the city. Having him take on the different gangs and everything. It's a very different dynamic than the jungle, which pretty much the rest of these movies take place in. So there's a lot of things about that I enjoy. But this is a very strange movie. There's a very strange like TV cop storyline that holds it all together with Danny Glover, and you got Gary Busey and all of them that are like the scientists trying to harness the Predator, and there's elements that are really cool that center on the Predator himself. All of the human stuff is very generic, like 90s TV action movie. Leprechaun 2, this one is painful. Most of these movies are not very good, but Leprechaun 2 is just a very generic sequel. There's not really a whole lot about this one that I ever remember, and I've seen it a number of times. Even as a kid, this one always was just kind of like that Blur movie. I know that there's a scene where he has a drinking contest with a guy and he ends up with like the fucking pot of gold in his stomach. I know that there's a scene where he's driving a go-kart, and I know that there's a scene where the protagonists are going through these tunnels that keep doing the Scooby-Doo thing where they show up from the other tunnels like they're warping. Beyond that, I can't tell you a fucking thing about this movie, and I just watched it last year to review it. So it's just one of those generic Leprechaun sequels that does not really have any standout sequences or elements to it to be more than just one of those late night Skinamax movies that you're like, oh yeah, I saw that once. And finally, we have Underworld Evolution, and this is a bloody good time. I think that the first two movies are damn good in the Underworld franchise. I think they're very underappreciated, actually. I think that this one especially is very, very good effects on the monsters. The monster effects are awesome with the giant vampire as well as the giant werewolf. I think that the action sequences are set up very well, especially the final action sequence that's in this cavern, and you have like the helicopter that comes down, which ends up being like the weapon of death that kills the big monsters, and the way that they set it up was really cool, the way that they choreographed it. I think that Celine as a character is really good in this one. Her relationship with Michael is developed a little bit more here, and I think that Michael, like his powers and the whole buildup of him supposed to be this badass like hybrid monster is actually utilized pretty well here with the way that he resurrects himself. The first film, I kind of thought that they really dropped the ball on that, so I really dig this one. I dig this second film. And aside from the next film in this franchise, you're not going to hear that very much anymore from the Underworld movies. Yeah, we're done. That's it. Last bloody good time from the Underworld. All right, guys, that does it for this one. I hope you enjoyed part 2 of this horror franchise series. If you want to click over here, you can watch part 1 of the horror franchise list. And I'm also going to put my Friday the 13th tier list over here if you're a fan of that franchise specifically. Thank you for watching. Please like and share this video and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss part 3 in about a week or so. Thank you for watching as always, and remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean that you have to be.